The gallery chambers stretched 3 kilometers across and held representatives from 400 species in their individual environmental pods, each one customized to their specific atmospheric needs and gravity requirements, while humans stood in the central floor breathing unfiltered air that would kill most species present within minutes. Ambassador Chun walked to the podium carrying a data tablet that held 3 centuries of carefully documented records. Her boots clicking against the crystalline floor in the silence that followed her request to speak, and the sound echoed in ways that made several insectoid delegates click their mandibles in discomfort. The ledger had taken 50 years to compile, completely because humanity kept records like no other species in the galaxy, and every contract signed under duress was documented. And every soldier who died defending Xeno borders was named, and every engineering miracle pulled off in impossible conditions was time-stamped and verified. Chun activated the holographic display, and the air above the council floor filled with numbers that climbed into figures most species struggled to comprehend because they dealt in approximate values and rough estimates, while humans counted every single unit down to the individual credit. 317 years ago, humanity was contacted by the Galactic Council. Chun began, and her voice carried through translation matrices to 400 different audio formats. We were told we would be welcomed as partners in a grand civilization spanning thousands of worlds. The numbers continued scrolling as she spoke, and each line represented a human life or a human achievement or a human resource extracted under agreements that seemed fair until you read the fine print that humanity had indeed read every word of. We were not told that partnership meant our soldiers would serve as shock troops in every border conflict, because our biology allows us to survive wounds that would kill any other species, Chun said, and the hologram shifted to show casualty reports from the Vrex-Kethral border wars, where human mercenaries had a 93% fatality rate over 5 years. The Vrex delegate in his methane-filled sphere shifted uncomfortably because those numbers were classified, and he had no idea humans kept their own records, and certainly didn't know they kept them so meticulously. We were not told that our engineers would be expected to maintain critical infrastructure in radiation zones and toxic atmospheres and crushing gravity wells, while being paid a fraction of what Xeno specialists receive for climate-controlled desk work. She continued, and another cascade of data filled the OS. Heavy Deshan. Observer tried to interject, but Chun simply increased her volume and kept speaking because she had the floor according to Wauch. Council rules that the council itself wrote, and now regretted. We were not told that our medical personnel would be dispatched to plague zones and biological hazard sites without adequate protective equipment, because it was cheaper to replace humans than to properly outfit Xeno doctors. And the hologram showed images that made several delegates look away from their viewing screens. The human medical casualty list from the Kethran plague. Response alone numbered in the thousands, and the compensation paid to their families would not have covered a single Xeno physician's insurance premium. Chun paused and let the numbers speak for themselves as they continued to scroll through the air in glowing letters that many species associated with warning signs and danger indicators, because red was a color that meant stop in most galactic languages. The total debt owed to humanity by the Galactic Council and its member species amounts to 47 trillion galactic credits using current market valuations, she said, and the specific figure appeared in the air above her head in numbers large enough to be read from every pod in the chamber. This accounts for unpaid labor and resource extraction and breach of contract terms and compensation for lives lost in service to species that did not even learn the names of the soldiers who died for them. The council chamber erupted in what passed for laughter among species that communicated through color shifts and pheromone clouds and electromagnetic pulses, and the human translator rendered it all as mocking amusement. The High Counselor of the assembled mind spoke through his translation matrix, and his words came out in that patronizing tone that Xenos reserved for species they considered primitive. Ambassador Chun, surely you understand that your species should be grateful for the opportunity to participate in galactic civilization. More laughter rippled through the chamber, and Chun stood perfectly still with her hands at her sides in a posture that humans recognized as parade rest, but that looked like casual relaxation to species who did not understand human body language. "We have participated for 3 centuries," Chun replied, and her voice had gone very quiet and very calm, in a way that made the 3 other humans in the chamber tense slightly. "We have bled for you and built for you and died for you and received nothing but contempt in return." The High Counselor waved a manipulator appendage in a gesture that meant dismissal. "If humanity is unsatisfied with the current arrangement, they are free to renegotiate their contracts." Chun smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, though most species in the chamber could not read human facial cues well enough to recognize the difference between a friendly smile and the predator's. "Warning, we are not here to renegotiate." She tapped her data tablet and transmitted a single file to every council member simultaneously, and the file was only 3 words long in every language in the galactic database. "We are here to inform you that humanity is withdrawing from all contracts and all agreements and all treaties effective immediately," Chun said. "The debt will be settled." The chamber fell silent in a way it never had before, because even species that communicated through methods other than sound seemed to stop their transmissions, and every environmental pod went very still. "You cannot simply withdraw from galactic civilization," the High Counselor said, and for the first time there was uncertainty in his translated voice. "We can, and we are," Chun replied. "Every human in council space is coming home, and every human facility will be shut down, and every human contract will be terminated, and you will learn exactly what humanity has been doing for you all these years." She turned and walked toward the exit, and the other human delegates fell in behind her, and their footsteps echoed in the silent chamber like a countdown. "This is unacceptable," the Vrex delegate shouted, and his voice modulator crackled with the force of his emission. "We have treaties and binding agreements." Chun stopped at the doorway and looked back at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. "You have pieces of paper that you never honored, and we have 300 years of documentation proving it, and now you have nothing." The humans left, and the great doors of the council chambers sealed behind them with a sound like a vault closing. Within 6 hours, the Tri-V networks across the galaxy broadcast the council session and the laughter of 400 species at humanity's audacity and the dismissal of their documented claims. Within 12 hours, every human colony in council space received the same encrypted message and emergency protocols that had been prepared in secret for 50 years activated simultaneously. Within 24 hours, the exodus began, and the galaxy was too busy laughing to notice that the Deathworlders were packing up and going home. Within 48 hours, the first systems began to fail, and the laughter stopped very quickly after that. The first sign that something was wrong came when the Vrex Concordat's border defense grid went offline at 1700 hours Galactic Standard Time, and the duty officer assumed it was a routine malfunction until he tried to contact the human engineering team and found their barracks empty, not abandoned in panic or stripped bare in anger, but methodically cleared with every piece of equipment accounted for and every security protocol properly shut down and a single data file left on the main console that contained transfer orders signed by Vrex Command authorizing the human personnel to return to Earth. The duty officer had never signed such orders, and neither had anyone in his chain of command, but the authorizations carried valid security codes that could only have come from someone with access to the highest levels of Vrex military systems. He was still trying to understand what happened when the first raider ships crossed the border and found nothing waiting for them except automated defense platforms that had not been maintained in 3 months and failed within minutes of sustained fire across The galaxy similar scenes played out in 1,000 different locations as human personnel simply vanished from their posts, carrying nothing but personal effects and leaving behind facilities that suddenly looked very vulnerable without the people who had been maintaining them. On Desha Prime, the atmospheric engineers discovered that every human technician had departed on the morning shuttle and taken with them all the custom tools they had fabricated themselves, because the standard Xeno equipment could not handle the high-pressure toxic environments where the actual maintenance work happened. The head engineer tried to access the maintenance logs and found them wiped clean according to data retention policies that humans had been citing for years, but that Xeno administrators had ignored because the systems always worked, so why worry about documentation? The systems worked because humans made them work through constant adjustment and repair and improvisation that never appeared in official reports, because Xeno supervisors wanted to believe their infrastructure was more robust than it actually was. By the third day, the atmospheric processors began showing efficiency drops, and the Deshan Environmental Council sent urgent requests to Earth for immediate technical support and offered double the previous contract rates. The response came back within an hour, and it was the same message that every Xeno government received when they tried to contact human personnel. All contracts have been terminated, and humanity is not accepting new agreements at this time. The Catherine medical facilities realized their problem when a new outbreak of the hemorrhagic plague started in the agricultural districts, and the automated systems flagged it for immediate human response teams that had been handling biological hazards on Catherine worlds for 80 years. The response teams did not answer their communications, and the Catherine Health Ministry sent security forces to the human medical compound, only to find it empty, except for a comprehensive decontamination record showing that every piece of human equipment had been sterilized and every biological sample had been destroyed according to protocols. The Catherine tried to deploy their own medical teams, but discovered that most of their trained personnel had never actually worked in active plague zones because humans always took those assignments, and now there was nobody who knew how to operate the isolation equipment in field conditions. The outbreak spread to 6 districts before they managed to contain it, and the casualty count reached numbers that would have been prevented with a single human medical team. The commercial shipping lanes began to collapse when human merchant vessels recalled to Earth and took with them the intricate knowledge of which routes were actually safe versus which ones looked safe on star charts but required constant navigation updates to avoid hazards. 3 major cargo haulers vanished in hyperspace when they tried to use human trade routes without human pilots, and the insurance companies raised rates by 300% overnight, which effectively shut down half the remaining commercial traffic. The auction houses of Venn watched their inventory values crash when merchants realized that 60% of high-demand goods were human-manufactured, and there would be no resupply, and the secondary markets could not produce comparable quality human fabrication. Techniques had become industry standard across multiple sectors because human engineers approached problems differently than species who evolved in gentler environments, and their solutions worked in conditions that would destroy more elegant Xeno designs. Within 2 weeks, the economic ripples had become waves, and the waves had become tsunamis, and financial networks that had been stable for centuries began showing stress fractures. The Galactic Council sent 3 delegations to the Sol system, and all 3 were stopped at the heliopause by defense platforms that had not been there 6 months ago. And when the delegates demanded to know when humans had militarized their home system, the response was simple: we have been fortifying Sol for 200 years, and you never bothered to check because you assumed we were too primitive to understand strategic defense in depth. The delegations could see the evidence on their sensor screens, and what had looked like asteroid mining operations were revealed as weapons platforms, and what had seemed like commercial shipyards were clearly military construction facilities, and the entire In her system was a fortress that could hold off a battle fleet. One delegate asked why humanity had never used this military capability to demand better treatment, and the human officer who responded actually laughed before answering. Because we did not want galactic territory or political power, and we hoped you would eventually recognize our contribution and treat us fairly. The word hoped carried a weight that made the translator matrices struggle, because it implied both optimism and the death of that optimism, and the delegates understood that they were not speaking to naive primitives, but to a species that had given the galaxy 3 centuries of chances and received nothing but exploitation. The 4th week brought the first government collapse when the Harmony Collective's food production failed completely, and their population centers began experiencing shortages that led to riots, and the central authority fractured into regional committees that immediately started fighting over remaining resources. The Harmony worlds had been producing food for export to 14 other species, and their agricultural systems were designed by human agronomists who understood crop rotation and pest management and soil chemistry in ways that the collective had never bothered to learn, because the harvests always came in every season without fail, except the harvests came because humans made them come through constant intervention that looked effortless only because the humans never complained about the work. The academic preserves of Sheldon went dark when their quantum server network collapsed and took with it the largest database in the galaxy, because the servers required maintenance in environments with radiation levels that killed most species within hours. Humans had been doing that maintenance in shifts for a century, and the bus that killed most species within the Gota species within hours. Humans had been doing that maintenance in shifts for a century, and they preserves had rewarded them with access to the lower-tier public databases while reserving the advanced research for Xeno scholars. Now the advanced research was gone, and the public databases were corrupted beyond recovery, and 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge was lost because the preserves had been too arrogant to teach anyone else how to maintain their own systems. The council chambers themselves experienced a power failure when the fusion core that had been running for 3,000 years finally exceeded its maintenance cycle without the human team that had been keeping it operational through improvised repairs and creative engineering. The backup systems activated, but they were only designed for temporary use, and the council building had to be evacuated, while Xeno engineers tried to figure out how to repair a reactor design that predated most of their civilizations. They found the maintenance logs and discovered that the primitive humans had been performing miracles of engineering to keep the ancient reactor running, and the logs were written in technical language that most Xeno engineers could not fully comprehend. Ambassador Chun received daily reports on the cascade failures, and she read them without satisfaction or joy, because humans took no pleasure in the suffering of others, even when that suffering was deserved. But she did not order a halt to the exodus, and she did not offer assistance, and when the council sent its 5th delegation begging for negotiation, she sent them back with a single question: do you acknowledge the debt? The answer was always some variation of refusal or deflection or attempts to negotiate partial recognition, and Chun's response never changed: then we have nothing to discuss. The Krell hegemony had ruled 47 star systems for 600 years through a combination of military might and economic dominance, and both collapsed within 2 months of the human exodus. Their military might had been built on human mercenaries who formed the shock troops and special operations forces and frontline combat units, while Krell officers commanded from secure positions and took credit for victories that humans achieved through blood and sacrifice. When the humans left, they took with them the institutional knowledge of how to actually fight a war rather than simulate one in training exercises. And the Krell generals discovered that their tactical databases were useless without people who understood how to adapt those tactics to real battlefield conditions. The first challenge came from the Krell colonial territories that had been held in submission through the threat of military intervention, and when test uprisings went unopposed because the hegemony could not deploy effective forces, the entire colonial structure began to fracture. Within 6 weeks, the hegemony was fighting 17 separate independence movements, and their fleets were suffering casualties at rates that would have been considered impossible because nobody had ever seen Krall forces without human support. The economic dominance collapsed even faster when the manufacturing centers that produced Krall goods shut down because humans had been maintaining the automated systems and training new technicians and handling quality control and managing the supply chains Krall administrators had assumed. These were low-skill positions that anyone could perform and never bothered to document the actual work involved. And now, they discovered that low skill meant something very different. When the workers were Deathworlders, who could operate in environments that would hospitalize most species, the factories went silent, and the warehouses emptied, and the Krall economy entered a death spiral that dragged down the currencies of 8 neighboring species, who had tied their financial systems to what they thought was a stable hegemon. The assembled minds of Paxis experienced something worse than economic collapse, because they had integrated human programmers and system administrators into their hive network infrastructure, and when those humans withdrew, they took with them the bridge codes that allowed different hive nodes to communicate. The minds had never understood how human cognition worked because they thought in terms of collective consciousness and distributed processing, and could not comprehend how individual minds could coordinate without neural linking. Human programmers had built translation layers between hive nodes that allowed the assembled minds to function as a unified intelligence, and when those layers shut down, the network fragmented into isolated clusters that could not share information or coordinate actions. Some clusters tried to re-establish connections using their own methods and created feedback loops that damaged their biological processors, and within a month, the assembled minds had lost cohesion entirely and reverted to individual hive nodes that barely recognized each other. Galactic historians would later mark this as the first time a true hive intelligence had experienced schizophrenia, and the implications terrified every collective species in council space. The auction houses of Venn tried to maintain their business model by marking up prices on remaining human goods, but they discovered that consumers were unwilling to pay premium rates for items that would never be replaced. The bottom fell out of the market when Forge Worlds attempted to reverse engineer human manufacturing techniques and produced items that looked identical to human work, but failed catastrophically under stress testing. A construction company on Venn Prime installed human-designed support beams that had been manufactured locally, and the building collapsed during the first storm cycle and killed 43 workers, and a investigation revealed that the beams had been made with the correct materials, but without understanding the heat treatment process that gave them strength. After that, nobody trusted non-human versions of human technology, and the value of authentic human goods skyrocketed, but there were no more authentic human goods coming to market, and the auction houses found themselves holding inventory that appreciated in value while their actual business operations ground to a halt. The border regions descended into chaos as raider groups and minor powers realized that nobody was maintaining the security networks that had kept them in check. And the species that had relied on human mercenaries discovered that hiring Xeno security forces cost 10 times as much and delivered a fraction of the effectiveness of Rex Concordat. Lost 6 colony worlds in 3 months, and their fleet commanders tried to mount counteroffensive operations, but found that their ships performed poorly in extended combat because human maintenance crews had been keeping them operational beyond their design specifications. Rex engineers could maintain ships according to the manual, but humans had been performing preventive maintenance and identifying problems. before they became critical and improvising solutions that kept vessels in service for decades. Past their planned retirement, now the fleet was learning the difference between maintained to standard and maintained by people who actually cared whether the ship survived the next battle. And the lesson was being taught in casualties and lost territory. The Council sent its largest delegation. Yet, and this time they came with actual negotiators instead of bureaucrats, and they requested permission to land on Luna instead of meeting in orbit. Ambassador Chun granted the request and specified that all meetings would take place in standard Earth gravity and atmosphere, and the Xeno delegates arrived in reinforced gravity harnesses and breathing apparatus that made them look like they were preparing for a combat operation. The lead negotiator was a Theshan diplomat named Keleth who had actually worked with humans before and understood that they were not primitives, but a species that had been systematically underestimated, and he opened the negotiation with something the Council had never offered before. We acknowledged that errors were made in our treatment of humanity, Keleth said, and the translator rendered his whistling speech into flat English that somehow carried genuine remorse. Errors, Chun replied, and her voice could have cut glass. You made errors the way a ship makes errors when it deliberately rams another vessel. Keleth shifted in his gravity harness, and the movement made clear how much effort it took to simply exist in one. Earth gravity, and Chun did not offer to reduce the gravity because this was exactly the point. Perhaps errors is insufficient, Keleth said. We failed to recognize humanity's contribution, and we failed to compensate you appropriately, and we failed to treat you as equals. You failed to treat us as sapient beings, Chun said. You treated us as convenient tools that happened to be able to speak. The other delegates started to object, but Keleth silenced them with a gesture that cost him visible effort in the higher gravity, and he focused entirely on Chun with the kind of attention that prey species learned when dealing with predators. Yes, Keleth said, and the single word hung in the air like a confession. We did exactly that, and we have no excuse except our own arrogance and short-sightedness. Chun waited, and Keleth continued because he understood that humans would not fill silence just to make others comfortable. The Council is prepared to offer full recognition of the dead and public, acknowledgement of our failures, and economic compensation at the rate specified in your ledger, Keleth said. We are also prepared to grant humanity permanent seats on the High Council with full voting rights and veto power. No, Chun said. The delegation went silent in multiple wavelengths as they tried to process a rejection of everything they thought humanity wanted. No to which part? Keleth asked carefully. No to all of it, Chun replied. We do not want your money because money does not restore the dead, and we do not want seats on a council that has demonstrated its complete moral bankruptcy. Then what do you want? Keleth asked, and his translator carried what might have been desperation. We want acknowledgement, Chun said. Real acknowledgement, and not diplomatic language that admits nothing while appearing to apologize. And we want it public, and we want it complete, and we want every species in council space to understand exactly what humanity was to you and what you did to us. And then, Keleth asked, and then you leave us alone, Chun said. Complete sovereignty and no treaties and no defense pacts and no obligations and no expectations that humans will come running when you need us. You would abandon galactic civilization, one of the other delegates said, and their translator rendered shock and horror. You already abandoned us, Chun replied. We just stopped pretending otherwise. She stood, and the meeting was clearly over, and Keleth remained seated in his gravity harness, because standing would have taken too much effort. I will take your terms to the council, Keleth said. But I must warn you that many species will refuse such complete acknowledgement. Then they will continue to collapse, Chun said without sympathy. And eventually, they will either accept our terms or they will cease to exist as functional civilizations, and either outcome is acceptable to us. The delegation left, and Chun watched their shuttle struggle against Earth's gravity and she thought about all the times humans had made that journey look easy while carrying equipment and wounded and refugees. The council chambers had been moved to a backup facility on Desha Prime because the primary building remained offline, and the emergency power systems were failing after 6 months of continuous operation without proper maintenance. The assembled representatives numbered only 200 now because a third of council species had collapsed entirely, and another third were too occupied with internal crises to send delegates, and the remainder were present primarily to witness what they knew would be a historic humiliation. Cliff stood at the central podium in a modified gravity field that reduced the strain on his body but could not eliminate the exhaustion that came from months of failed negotiations and watching civilizations crumble. The council has voted to accept humanity's terms, he announced, and his voice carried none of the diplomatic polish that usually characterize council proceedings. We will issue a full public acknowledgement of our treatment of humanity and our exploitation of their labor and our failure to honor our agreements. The chamber remained silent because there was nothing to say, and no species present could claim they had opposed the policies that led to this moment. The acknowledgement will be broadcast on all Sci-Fi networks in every major language and will be permanently archived in the public record. Kelleth continued. There will be no diplomatic phrasing and no softening of the facts and no attempt to contextualize our actions as anything other than systemic exploitation. He activated a holographic display, and the text appeared in the air above the podium, and every delegate could read it in their native language simultaneously. The document was comprehensive and brutal in its honesty, and it detailed 3 centuries of broken promises and casual cruelty and deliberate disregard for human life. And it named specific incidents where human soldiers died because Xeno commanders used them as disposable assault forces, and it documented contracts where humans were paid a fraction of fair rates for work that no other species would attempt. And it acknowledged that the entire council economy had been built on the assumption that humans could be exploited indefinitely. The final paragraph was the part that would echo through galactic history. We, the assembled species of the Galactic Council, acknowledged that humanity carried our civilization on their backs, while we mocked them for their burden, and we benefited from their sacrifice while denying them the respect they deserved. And we have no justification for our actions, and no excuse for our failures, and we accept full responsibility for the consequences of our arrogance. No delegate objected because there was no point in objecting, and the vote had already been taken, and the alternative was watching their remaining civilizations collapse into complete failure. Ambassador Chun has reviewed this text and confirmed it meets the requirements, Kelleth said. The broadcast will commence immediately following this session. He paused and seemed to gather himself for what came next. Additionally, the Council acknowledges humanity's right to complete sovereignty and independence from all Council authority. And we formally recognize the Human Compact as a separate political entity with no obligations to Council species except those which humanity chooses to undertake of their own free will. The Human Compact had been established 3 months earlier, when 6 minor species had approached Earth requesting alliance and had been willing to accept terms that treated them as genuine partners rather than subordinates. These species had been fringe members of Council civilization and had their own grievances about exploitation and dismissal, and they recognized that humanity was offering something the Council never had, which was respect. The Compact Charter was only 15 pages long compared to the Council's 3,000-page founding document, and most of those 15 pages were about mutual defense and fair trade, and the right of any member to withdraw without penalty. It was the kind of agreement that species made when they actually trusted each other and wanted to build something together rather than maintain hierarchies of power. The Council also acknowledges that all human-built infrastructure in Council space is the property of humanity and may not be seized or operated without explicit human permission, Kelleth said, and this clause had caused the most debate because it meant that dozens of critical facilities were now legally off-limits. Council species had argued that infrastructure built on their worlds should belong to them regardless of who designed or constructed it, but they discovered that human contracts had always included ownership clauses that Xeno administrators had never bothered to read now. Those clauses were being enforced, and the choice was clear, which was acknowledge human ownership or face legal action that would tie up already struggling economies for decades. Finally, Kelleth said, and his voice carried what might have been personal shame rather than just diplomatic regret. The Council acknowledges the debt of 47 trillion credits and agrees to a payment schedule that will take 300 years to complete. The number was symbolic because everyone present knew that many Council species would not survive 300 years, and the ones that did would spend centuries paying for the mistakes of their predecessors. But humanity had insisted on the payment plan because they wanted the debt acknowledged, and they wanted every generation of Council species to remember what their governments had done. Chun had been explicit about this during negotiations, and she had said something that Kelleth would remember for the rest of his life. "We do not need your money, but we need you to feel the weight of what you did, and the only way you will feel it is if you carry it for as long as we carried you." The broadcast went out across every Tri-V network simultaneously, and the galaxy watched as the Council publicly admitted to 3 centuries of systematic exploitation. The reactions ranged from shock among populations who had never considered where their comfortable lifestyles came from to anger among species who felt the Council had capitulated to primitive Deathworlders to grim satisfaction among the minor species who had always known they were not alone in being exploited on Earth and 100 colony worlds and the 6 compact partner homeworlds. Humans watched the broadcast in silence. There was no celebration because this was not a victory but a settling of accounts, and the cost had been paid in lives that could never be restored. Ambassador Chun watched from her office on Luna, and she thought about the names in the ledger and all the soldiers and engineers and medics who died believing they were building something better. They had built something better, but it had taken 3 centuries and a complete withdrawal from galactic civilization for the galaxy to recognize it. The next day, the first trade agreement was signed between the Human Compact and the Theshan Sphere, and the terms were completely different from anything the Council had ever offered. Humans would provide technical assistance and engineering support, and the Theshans would pay fair market rates and provide technology sharing on equal terms, and either party could terminate the agreement with 6 months' notice. It was a normal trade agreement between sovereign powers, and the fact that it seemed revolutionary was itself an indictment of how the Council had operated. Other species began approaching the Compact with similar requests, and humanity evaluated each one carefully and rejected more than they accepted because they were not interested in rebuilding the same exploitative systems under a different name. The species they accepted were the ones willing to actually change how they approached partnerships and willing to invest in their own capabilities rather than relying on human labor, and willing to treat humans as equals rather than convenient tools. The Council itself began a slow process of reorganization as species that survived adapted to functioning without human support. Some developed their own engineering corps, trained to work in hazardous environments, using protective equipment that was expensive but effective, and some restructured their economies to be less dependent on external labor, and some simply accepted a lower standard of living than they had enjoyed before. The ones that adapted survived, and the ones that refused to adapt either collapsed or were absorbed by neighbors, and the galactic map began to look very different as old empires fragmented and new alliances formed, humanity watched this transformation with interest, but not interference. Because they had learned that you could not force other species to value you, and attempts to do so only led to resentment instead. They focused on building their own civilization and exploring their own space and developing technologies that did not depend on galactic standards. Human ships began pushing into regions that Council species had marked as too dangerous for exploration, and they found worlds and resources and occasionally other species that had been isolated from galactic civilization. Some of these species were offered compact membership, and some preferred to remain independent, and humanity respected both choices because they understood that sovereignty meant nothing if it was not. Genuine Ecolith retired from Council service after the acknowledgement and spent his remaining years writing a history of the human exodus and its consequences. The book was titled The Price of Arrogance, and it became required reading in diplomatic schools across the galaxy because it detailed exactly how civilizations fall when they take their foundations for granted. 50 years after the Exodus, the first generation born after humanity's withdrawal from Council space came of age, and they grew up in a galaxy that their grandparents would barely recognize. The Galactic Council still existed, but it represented only 60% of its former membership, and its authority extended primarily to mutual defense pacts and cultural exchanges rather than the economic dominance it once wielded. The great empires that had ruled for centuries were mostly gone, and in their place were smaller confederations and regional alliances and independent worlds that managed their own affairs without expecting other species to maintain their infrastructure. The human generation that came of age in this new galaxy had never experienced being treated as expendable labor because they had never worked for Xeno employers who saw them as tools. They knew the history because it was taught thoroughly in schools and memorialized in monuments and discussed in families. But they knew it as history rather than lived experience. Marcus Chen graduated from the Academy on Mars with degrees in xenobiology and diplomatic relations, and he carried his great-grandmother's name with pride because Ambassador Chen had become a historical figure whose negotiation tactics were studied across multiple species. He received his first assignment with the Compact Diplomatic Corps and shipped out to Desha Prime, where humanity maintained an embassy that served as the primary liaison between the Compact and the Reform Council. The embassy building was designed to human specifications, which meant it sat in full Earth normal gravity and atmosphere, and visiting Xenos had to wear support equipment just to enter, which was entirely intentional. Marcus met his supervisor, Ambassador Rodriguez, in an office that overlooked the Deshan capital, and the view showed a city rebuilt after the collapse with architecture that mixed Deshan aesthetics with human engineering principles. They learned, Rodriguez said without preamble as she watched Marcus study the skyline. Not all of them, and not fast enough to save their empires, but the ones who survived learned. She handed him a data tablet that contained his briefing materials, and Marcus scanned through reports on current Deshan politics and economic conditions and social reforms. Your job is to evaluate their request for an expanded trade agreement, Rodriguez said. They want human engineers to help upgrade their atmospheric systems, and they are offering full technology exchange and profit sharing. Marcus noted the terms, and they were fair by any standard, which itself was remarkable because Deshan offers had been exploitative for centuries before the Exodus. What do you think? Rodriguez asked, and Marcus understood this was a test. The terms are acceptable, he said carefully, but I want to verify that they have actually invested in training their own engineers, rather than expecting us to do all the specialized work. Rodriguez smiled, and it was the kind of smile that said he had passed the test. Good, and that is exactly what you need to verify, because we are not interested in recreating the old system where humans do the dangerous work while Xenos take credit. Marcus spent 6 months on Desha, evaluating their technical education programs and interviewing their engineers and inspecting their facilities. What he found was a species that had genuinely changed their approach, because they had no choice. The Deshans had lost 60% of their industrial capacity during the collapse, and the survivors had been forced to learn how to maintain their own systems or die. They had developed training programs that pushed their people into environments that Deshans would have considered impossible before, and they had accepted casualty rates that would have been unthinkable when they could simply hire humans. It was not that they had suddenly developed respect for human sacrifice, but rather they had been forced to make similar sacrifices themselves, and that experience had taught them what their arrogance had cost. Marcus approved a trade agreement with conditions that included Deshan investment in safety equipment and ongoing training programs and regular audits to ensure compliance. The agreement was signed and human engineers arrived on Desha to work alongside Deshan counterparts as teachers and partners rather than expendable labor. Similar agreements were being signed across the galaxy as species that survived the collapse learned to approach humanity differently. The Vrex Concordat had been reduced to 12 systems from their original 47, but they had stabilized by developing their own military doctrine that did not rely on human shock troops. Their new approach was less effective in raw combat terms, but it was sustainable, and it was theirs, and they had stopped losing territory once they accepted that they needed to fight their own battles. The U Compact had grown to 23 member species, and humanity remained the largest single member, but no longer the overwhelming majority. The newer members brought their own strengths and perspectives, and Compact had evolved into something that none of the founding species had quite anticipated, which was a genuine multi-species civilization. Built on mutual respect, there were still tensions because cultural differences did not disappear just because species agreed to work together. But the Compact had mechanisms for addressing those tensions that did not involve exploitation. When disputes arose, they were mediated through councils where every species had equal voice, and decisions required consensus rather than majority vote, which meant that progress was slow but stable. The Human Compact Navy had become the largest military force in the galaxy, not through conquest but through voluntary alliance, as species requested defense agreements and were willing to contribute their own forces on equal terms. Admiral Jang commanded the fleet from the carrier Washington, which patrolled the border regions where raiders and pirates still operated. His command included human ships and Deshan cruisers and Vrex destroyers and vessels from a dozen other species, all operating under unified command structures that respected different tactical doctrines. Jang had fought in the border wars before the Exodus, and he remembered what it was like to serve under Xeno commanders who treated human casualties as acceptable losses. Now he commanded a fleet where every species fought together because they chose to, and every loss was mourned, regardless of species, because they had built something worth defending. The old council territories were divided between reformed governments that had adapted and collapsed regions that had fragmented into smaller states, and a few holdouts that still refused to acknowledge their failures. The holdouts were struggling because the galaxy had moved on, and the economic networks that once supported them no longer existed, and their populations were leaving for regions where governments had learned from the exodus on Earth. The archives of the ledger had become a memorial site where visitors could access the complete records of humanity's 3 centuries in council service. Every name was listed, and every contract was documented, and every broken promise was preserved so that future generations would remember what their ancestors endured. Marcus visited the archives during his leave and walked through halls lined with holographic displays, showing the faces of soldiers and engineers and medics who died in service to species that never learned their names. He stopped at one display that showed a medical team lost during the Catherine Plague response, and he read their service records and their final reports and the compensation that was never paid to their families. A Russian diplomat stood nearby, studying the same display, and Marcus recognized her from the embassy briefings as one of the new generation trained after the collapse. "I come here every time I visit Earth," she said, and her translator carried something that might have been shame. "My government requires it for anyone in diplomatic service." Marcus nodded, and they stood in silence for a moment before she continued. "We cannot change what our predecessors did," she said, "but we can make certain it is never forgotten and never repeated. That is all anyone can do." Marcus replied, and he meant it, because holding grudges against people who were not yet born when the exploitation occurred served no purpose. The galaxy had learned its lesson, and the cost had been enormous. But the lesson was holding. 300 years of systematic exploitation had been answered with a complete withdrawal, and the resulting collapse had forced every surviving species to confront what they had built their civilizations on. Some had adapted and some had fallen, and all of them understood now that Deathworlders were not convenient tools, but sapient beings who deserved respect and fair treatment. Human compact continued to grow, and humanity continued to explore their own space, and occasionally species from the old council approached them with requests for alliance. Each request was evaluated carefully and accepted or rejected based on whether the requesting species demonstrated genuine change rather than temporary desperation. The phrase "settling the debt" had entered common usage across the galaxy in multiple languages, and it meant different things to different species. For some it was a warning about the cost of arrogance, and for others it was a reminder that exploitation always came due eventually, and for a few it was an acknowledgement that humanity had been right to demand what they were owed. Marcus returned to Desha and continued his work facilitating agreements between species that were learning to treat each other as equals.